This Week in Richmond is made possible in part by the Virginia Education Association. An investment in teachers today will pay dividends tomorrow. Dignity Memorial. The Dignity Network provides professional and compassionate funeral, memorial, cremation, and cemetery services throughout the Commonwealth of Virginia. Virginia Hospital and Healthcare Association for jobs, the economy, and public health, committed to advancing health and economic opportunity for all Virginians. Virginia Tourism Corporation, promoting why Virginia is for lovers, lovers of wine and craft beers, the outdoors, beaches, history, music, and more. Fall in love with Virginia at virginia.org. Additional support provided by these sponsors. And by the members of Virginia's public television stations. Thank you.
Welcome to This Week in Richmond. I have extended an invitation to all the committee chairs in the House and the Senate, as well as the ranking minority members in all those committees, to be on This Week in Richmond, and delighted to have Delegate Vivian Watts, who's ranking member on all three committees you serve on, and Finance Committee being one of the key ones, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Those others we'll talk about at some other time in the future. But
I look forward to it.
Appreciate what you've been doing from the floor of the House and seeking to educate those of us about what's happening on tax matters. I know you've brought your charts, and so let's get into the tax issues that really are confronting everyone in the Commonwealth of Virginia.
Yes, it's a very interesting public policy challenge because normally you have expertise and so that it's more narrowly focused, but each and every member, obviously, for each and every constituent that we have, who's now just beginning to fill out their taxes, right. It's something that you've got to be accountable for. And yet, poor members, some of them who have never filled out their taxes, they've always turned it over to a CPA. Some of them are CPAs, and yet some of them may be filling out their own taxes for the first time as they wend their way through their millennial experience. Right. So that trying to convey to the members the complexity that we're dealing with. The complexity is multiplied over and over and over again. First of all, fine print from what Congress did over a year ago. You've got hundreds of fine print changes, multiplied times the life experience of close to 4 million taxpayers. About 3.6 million are Virginia residents. How are they going to interpret all of those changes when the federal government didn't even come out with their regulations until well into the fall? We had hoped that we could have a special session so that we really could start to unravel all of these layers upon layers of changes. And instead, what we're dealing with, as I indicated, we're right on tax season. Everybody's figuring it out. So to conform, as Virginia always has, with the federal changes means that that conformity in many instances is playing out with a different tax bill for what you owe in Virginia taxes because it's tied to the federal. Yes. So trying to unravel all of that at a level where people can begin to understand in digestible bites and yet credible enough so that it can pass muster with the CPAs out there, as well as I started in early September when the tax department released, actually it was in August, when they released an analysis that they had contracted for through Chainbridge Analytics, trying to, again, as studiously as possible, work out all of the projections of the numbers if. And from that effort, again, trying to be credible and yet understandable, that's where I started launching any number of charts to try to bring it on home for people to understand each bite that we have to deal with.
So get us to our first chart.
Our first chart. All right, this is one that is I have here today right now, although I understand you have a copy of it, is in fine print for the viewers. But basically it's saying that the bulk of Virginia taxpayers won't be paying more in taxes, but about 1/4 of the taxpayers, resident taxpayers, will be paying more in Virginia taxes. And some of those individuals will also be paying more in federal taxes. And that's this first breakout on this chart as far as who will be paying more versus those who will be paying less in either Virginia and or federal taxes. So when you look at that, you say, well, who are those taxpayers? Now I have a big chart. This is one that I did during the floor presentation as the first and most basic chart. Of those 1 in 4 that are paying more in taxes, it's made up of about 40% of those individuals will have adjusted gross incomes less than $50,000. About 35% of them, a third, will have incomes adjusted gross between 50 and 125, and then about 25% will have incomes over 125,000. So within those basic income groupings, how much more will they be paying? Well, as you look at Chainbridge Analytics, approximately a 4% increase for those in the lowest income range of under 50,000, about 3.5% increase for those between 50 and 125, 2.5% increase for the higher incomes.
You know, some people may be saying, I thought the federal tax law that was passed was going to cause a reduction in taxes.
For 3/4 of the Virginia taxpayers, it will.
Okay.
But this is the 1/4 where the way in which, particularly what the federal government did in raising the standard deduction, they took away a number of individual deductions that people had done before. And when you play that out, if you have, under Virginia law, if you do a standard deduction at the federal level, which is now $24,000 rather than $12,000, you have to do a standard deduction at the state level, which is only $6,000 and has been $6,000 since 2005.
Okay.
So since 2005, married couples $6,000. At that time, the federal government was $10,000. Singles were $3,000 and $5,000. Virginia has not changed those standard deductions since 2005. They've stayed steady, as opposed to the federal government, which every year that standard deduction goes up by the value of the dollar, goes up by inflation, just as individual exemptions and tax rates go up. So you saw that you gradually were widening that gap more and more, and then along comes the federal tax changes where where by taking away specific deductions or capping others, they change from 12,000 to 24,000 with a huge gap in between. So we've had people say, well, then why can't I do standard on federal and still itemize on the state, and then I wouldn't have any change? Well, there's a couple of biggest problem. First of all, is that I hate to tell anybody, but the state doesn't audit your tax returns. We piggyback on the federal auditing capability. So that was one of the advantages also from an administrative point of view of always having conformity.
Right.
So if they've taken away deductions, we will have no way of tracking whatever you put down on paper, without really gearing up a major audit capability, which we've never had. In addition to that, the fact that some of these deductions have just disappeared, then you have issues of the cap and whether or not you continue to conform on that basis. There will be some of these individual deductions that we will be debating, because if something is just capped, then all of the documentation of what you are claiming is the same. It's just you don't get as much of it. And that would be something like state and local taxes, or at the very high end of incomes, the fact that the federal government removed the $313,000 cap on your total deductions. And so at the very wealthy in Virginia, it's the reverse. We're losing $78 million because the very wealthy now no longer have their deductions capped. And again, we're losing $78 million at the $1 million range, as these people now are able to claim their total, not just part of their deduction.
And we'll tell our viewers, we're talking on January 25th. Mm-hmm. They'll be seeing the show very shortly after this, and the session's moving on quickly. We're coming up on a couple of weeks in which the budget would need to be finalized in each chamber, and absent the matter of getting worked out on this, it certainly more than complicates the issue that the Appropriations Committee and Senate Finance Committee has in trying to determine what money is available for the budget.
So starting with that deadline, let me again underscore the fact that we really don't know how much money is involved, because we don't know how all these changes are going to play out in taxpayer behavior and decisions. So you can go from a high-end estimate of $600 million more coming in because of those changes to much, much less than that. And the issue is whether or not that behavior will be sustained. So year after year, as people look at this and say, you know, I'm going to do better if I do it this way rather than that way. So these layers upon layers of, I've once described it, understand that a tarantula's spider web is much more sticky than the normal spider web. Well, it's certainly a spider web. It's not a can of worms, because so much is dependent upon other activities to try to know, besides the fact that we have all the taxpayers who have to pay their taxes for this year, and whatever changes we may make to, again, my emphasis has always been looking at any changes we make going back to the people who have in fact paid the most, rather than just willy-nilly addressing one thing or another, which might make the inequity even worse. I'm not sure what our time is, but I want to make sure that the viewers get an opportunity to look at this chart. This would be the alternative of increasing the standard deduction. Anytime you increase the standard deduction, every single taxpayer who's doing a standard deduction is going to get the same amount. So therefore, half of that money would flow to those at the lower income, with the break point being just over $40,000. So that, for example, this line here, my graphic actually is at the $75,000 to $100,000 line, would be up here as you look at those benefits. But this would go a long way towards the inequity, addressing that inequity that's been allowed to grow since 2005 because we didn't make any adjustment for the value of the dollar, adjusting all these things for inflation.
Delegate Vivian Watts, we wish we had more time, but thank you so much for laying this out, and people may want to watch this a time or two and go through all those charts, because it's a critical matter to be worked out.
And again, our changes in how do we return the monies this tax year.
Yes.
That's another challenge in whether we have to look at refunds or how we in fact do it.
thank you very much for being on This Week in Richmond.
My pleasure,
and
thank you.
we'll have you back when this matter gets settled. Thank you. Delighted to have Delegate Mark Sickles on This Week in Richmond. Mark, you've been in the General Assembly since 2004, but in that relatively short time, you're the ranking member, minority member on HWI, Health, Welfare, and Institutions, and also Privileges and Elections, and just one other Democrat ranking more on the Appropriations Committee. So you've got some critical committees and issues on both the committees, and critical issues that you yourself are introducing, whether it's sports betting or whether it's election issues or whatever. So I just want you to talk about any of those that you would like to tell our viewers about.
Well, on the Privileges and Elections Committee, we have a agenda that's similar to other years. Generally, my side tries to make voting easier and more accessible to folks, and maybe have more early voting and easier registration procedures, things like that. We failed again on those kind of things this year. The big issue that's before us now is what we might do on nonpartisan redistricting or nonpartisan citizen-led redistricting. The Senate has sent us over a bill that is not the one that preferred by Virginia 2021, but one that we hope to help perfect as it goes through the process, that would take some or most of the self-interest of we politicians out of it and give it back to a more broad citizen group to draw the lines that we run in. In healthcare, there's many issues going on.
Right.
We are always, Medicaid is the second largest expenditure in the state government, and it's a $10 billion program here, and we are doing a couple things that the agency is pressed on at the same time. One is the expansion population, which we worked on last year, which was mainly, not totally, but mainly childless adults that are poor, that have never had routine health care before. Now, if they qualify for Medicaid being less than 138% of poverty, they'll be assigned to one of 6 insurance plans, what we call MCOs, to manage their health care in the future. We've got a couple 100,000 have signed up so far, and they expect to get up to maybe 350,000 Virginians having health care for the first time. That's exciting, but at the same time, we're doing that a completely separate track. We are putting all of our frail and elderly population in managed care as well in a program called CCC Plus. And for the first time last year or so, this is still being implemented with some bumps in the road, the nursing homes would have an insurance company in between the patient and the nursing home. And we were able to save money when we did that for our CHIPS program called FAMOUS in Virginia, to wring some efficiencies out of that. And hopefully over a period of maybe 4 or 5 years, we'll be able to see efficiencies in this other population. Most states have not gone this far as we have, so we're pushing the envelope a little bit, and I want it to work, and I am skeptical that this is going to provide the savings that we hope for. In fact, our bust in the Medicaid forecast is due to this program, mainly.
I was going to ask you about that, because that made news a week or 2 weeks ago about the significant, some millions of dollars off of the forecast.
Yeah. Well, that's a bill we have to pay, and so that's coming off the top. Fortunately for Virginians, we have a healthy economy. We have the Wayfair decision, which is providing more revenue from internet sales that were heretofore not taxed or not enforced, a tax that was imposed but not really paid. Some of the biggest internet sales companies have been paying, and so it's a guesstimate how many more they'll bring in.
Right.
So we'll have that, plus the growing economy itself is giving us some revenues to be able to pay this Medicaid bill, plus do some other things.
So on the Appropriations Committee, you've certainly got some challenges. Delegate Watts was talking about the finance side and what's
Right.
going to happen on conformity or not conformity or
Yes.
whatever. But you all are trying to figure out a budget.
We are, and we can't really do that until that tax bill is finalized or we decide what we're going to do this year. We could pass something that might punt it a little bit, and people that we decide to provide refunds to, we can do that later. That's a possibility, but I'm hoping that by early next week there'll be an agreement. I think the majority in both the House and the Senate are trying to get something together, and the Senate leadership has definitely a different approach to how to handle the tax situation than the House leadership does. So hopefully over the weekend there'll be a lot of people working on this, and early next week we need to get on with this. We need conformity so that people can pay their taxes without pulling their hair out.
And this is the weekend of January 25, 26, 27. You'll be back. Federal government still shut down, but state government doesn't shut down. You got
No,
to
sir.
work out a balanced budget.
No, sir, we don't have that kind of flexibility, and I'd hate to see the day that we shut down. We have to have discipline. We have to make hard decisions. We can't just help everybody who needs to help, and that's what's tough about being on Appropriations Committee, because so many of the requests we get from the governor and from our fellow members can't be funded. So we have to make tough choices.
Your district includes part of Fairfax County.
It's all in Fairfax County.
And I would think that in your district you would have a significant number of federal workers and a fairly, maybe a good chunk of the ones that are among that 800,000 or so.
Oh, yes, sir. David, we have a lot. I do have Fort Belvoir in my district, parts of it. Fort Belvoir is the biggest employment center in Fairfax County, even bigger than Tysons Corner. There's 100 different Defense Department agencies there, but the Defense Department had its appropriation by the beginning of the fiscal year, and so that has not been a problem. But all the employees on critical agencies, many of whom live in our districts in Northern Virginia, are hurting badly.
And contractors who do work for,
Yeah.
who are not counted among the 800,000.
And actually their livelihood is even more at threat, because they may not get paid back. And the federal employees that are working without a paycheck right now will get paid back, but it's really financing this period now, and people don't know what to do. They're especially in the lower grade levels of the government, people don't have the kind of savings they need to get through. This will be the third paycheck coming up that they'll miss next week.
What are some other, before our time slips by, any other challenges you see? And I mentioned sports betting first, as a bill you introduced, but are all the expansions of gambling issues going into a study, or does that include sports betting?
Yes, sir. Well, we have been trying, and the vast array of interests that are helping push my bill along are trying to keep this separate. We are not a casino bill.
Right.
The casinos would be, if there ever were become legal in Virginia, could be affected by what we do in my sports betting bill. But the reason this is key now is that since the Supreme Court decision last May, unlocking the ability for states other than Nevada to have a sports book, every state is doing it. In Maryland, which is 5 miles from my house, the governor, the Senate Majority Leader, the Speaker of the House are just working on the details of their sports betting legislation. The D.C. City Council is going to have sports betting in the stadiums and ballpark in D.C. this summer. So this is many Virginians go to MGM right across the river. They go to the ballpark. 60% of the Nationals fans in the seat are Virginians. They'll be right there able to wager on betting. Sports betting is different from casino games. It's much less profitable. There's not a huge pot of money. There is money out there for us to take, and because illegal online betting occurs every day, it's going on right now, we want to capture some of that back and put a small tax on it. So 95% of the money that is wagered in sports betting goes back to the players, and there's a small part taken off, that's the part that's taxed. So it's not a pot of gold, but it is money that I'm going to put into research if my bill were to pass in its current form.
Dr. Sickles, we thank you so much for being on This Week in Richmond, and we'll be watching what happens on the Appropriations Committee, as well as Privileges and Elections, and in the Health Committee. So we thank you for all of your leadership and all of
Well,
those.
thanks for inviting me, and come see us in Fairfax County sometime, where the new Army Museum is going to open up in April and draw people from around the world.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.
This Week in Richmond is made possible in part by the Virginia Education Association. An investment in teachers today will pay dividends tomorrow. Dignity Memorial. The Dignity Network provides professional and compassionate funeral, memorial, cremation, and cemetery services throughout the Commonwealth of Virginia. Virginia Hospital and Healthcare Association for jobs, the economy, and public health. Virginia Tourism Corporation, promoting why Virginia is for lovers, lovers of wine and craft beers, the outdoors, beaches, history, music, and more. Fall in love with Virginia at virginia.org. Additional support provided by these sponsors. And by the members of Virginia's public television stations. Thank you.